You went to law school? Elizabeth Warren tilted her head, smiled with a hint of mischief, and continued, because honestly, Ted, you sound more like YouTube Shorts than the Supreme Court. A laugh rolled through the center seats. A prolonged ooh echoed from the right. That familiar reaction when a sharp jab lands just right. The host tried to maintain composure, glancing over at Ted Cruz. He didn't frown. He didn't smirk. He didn't move, just blinked, slow and controlled, as if calibrating his room. Camera 2 instinctively zoomed in for a close-up of Cruz, but the director waved it off, signaling for a wide shot. Camera 3, ignoring the banter, swung down the length of the audience, landing on the very last row. There, a young Latina girl, maybe 19 or 20, sat upright, hair in a tight bun, white shirt crisp, hands clasped. She didn't smile. She didn't look away. She just stared at Ted Cruz, unblinking. She wasn't a VIP, not a speaker, not a debate team star, just someone whose presence, for some reason, made Camera 3 hold the shot. Warren didn't notice. She kept smiling, riding the energy of her own wit. The crowd still believed they were witnessing just another expertly delivered joke. Only a handful near Camera 3 started to glance at the girl in the back row, wondering, who is she? Have you ever been judged because of your accent, your background, or the words you choose? Maybe you didn't speak with the vocabulary they expected, or maybe you sounded too much like home. Where are you watching this video from? If you've ever heard that loaded, what school did you go to? No answer needed, just leave a dot so we know you're here. The room was Studio G, a modern space just wide enough for 60 people in a tight arc. Center stage, a low gray carpet, 2 charcoal leather chairs, a round glass table, and gentle lighting from 3 sides. The show, Voice of Power. Today's question, what is intelligence and who gets to define it? The host, Raiden March, was a seasoned interviewer, presidents, prisoners, billionaires, bus drivers. He disliked conflict, but he understood how to let it simmer, just enough to keep every seat filled. Elizabeth Warren was introduced first. Navy blazer, perfectly set hair, an open, practiced expression. Her greeting was confident, her tone deliberate. Some younger viewers nodded. She knew how to own the stage. The host listed her resume: former presidential candidate, tireless consumer advocate, someone who had challenged Wall Street and academia alike. Applause, precise and measured. Then Ted Cruz entered, not in flashy office wear, just a simple black suit, understated tie, no showy cufflinks. He didn't smile to win favor, but he didn't avoid anyone's eyes either. Raiden gestured for him to sit and introduced Texas Senator, former Supreme Court clerk, and to many, a fierce defender of the Constitution. The applause was softer, but a few in the back clapped longer. Warren glanced at Cruz, not hostile, just the look of a veteran sizing up an opponent. She measured his intellect by the way he took his seat, rigid, unflinching, composed. Raiden launched the discussion. Let's talk about education. Is it about degrees, language, or results? Warren answered first, measured, professorial. To me, education isn't about where you come from. It's about having the knowledge and the courage to speak to anyone without hiding behind emotion. She paused, weighing her next words. I've worked with people who never set foot at Harvard, but when they spoke, they made everyone listen. Raiden turned to Cruz. I believe education shouldn't be a barrier of jargon, but a bridge built on experience, Ted Cruz replied, his tone earnest but direct. Raiden nodded, ready for more, but Elizabeth Warren cut in with a half smile. Ted, you sound like a motivational poster. A few chuckles scattered through the audience. Some older viewers shrugged. A college student looked down at their sneakers, a faint smile flickering. Raiden pulled up a statistic. According to recent studies, about 27% of Latino Americans have a bachelor's degree or higher, yet their presence on national debate stages is less than 8%. Senator Warren, what do you make of who gets to define true intellect? Warren smiled, her words measured, but there was a sharper edge now. I think the media often confuses emotional storytelling for genuine expertise. We can't allow intellectual forums to become echo chambers for the loudest voice, where passion is mistaken for proof. Her gaze fell subtly toward Cruz, challenging but not overtly combative. Cruz didn't react, just tilted his head with the patience of someone who's heard the argument before, quietly waiting to see how far his counterpart would take it. Raiden continued, and though the audience was still attentive, some began to shift in their seats, sensing the current changing, something subtle beneath the words. Warren added, I value personal stories, but when someone claims to represent their whole community and speaks like they're streaming on TikTok, I worry we're watering down what it means to be truly informed. Her words weren't loud, but they landed with a quiet thud, echoing in the studio. Raiden glanced at Cruz. He didn't respond, just lowered his eyes to his palms for a second, pressed his lips together, then looked up. Not defensive, not combative, just someone who knew what was coming next. The camera panned the audience. The same young Latina student in the back row quietly opened a small canvas pouch in her lap. She slipped a folded note onto the seat beside her, the crease crisp, the corners slashed as if carefully torn from a notebook. She didn't glance around, just kept her gaze on Cruz. No one in the studio noticed, but camera 3 didn't leave her, and anyone watching the replay might sense something was starting. Raiden March adjusted his mic and eyed the studio clock. The danger zone for talk shows, minutes 6 and 7, was approaching. If things got dull, viewers would check their phones. He turned to Cruz. Senator Cruz, when you say education is a bridge, have you ever been accused of being too emotional, of preaching rather than teaching? Cruz nodded calmly. Many times, Raiden. Usually from folks who believe knowledge is something only they're allowed to own. A few light chuckles, sympathetic, as if some viewers felt the same way. Warren sat up, clearly waiting for this moment. Well then, Ted, what's your definition of critical thinking when you teach your students or your community? Raiden shot Warren a surprised glance at her quick shift in tone. Cruz didn't roll his eyes. He answered in a steady voice. Critical thinking means having the courage to question even your own deepest beliefs. Several heads nodded in the audience. Warren turned her palms up with a polite, practiced smile. Nice, that sounds like something from a Monday morning Twitter thread. The line was delivered softly, but it made a man in the middle row pause, tilting his head, not quite sure if things were about to go off script. Raiden kept things moving. Senator Warren, you've previously said that many modern activists use education as a banner to mask a lack of structured argument. Can you elaborate on that? Warren didn't hesitate. Yes, I never said they were ignorant. I said they're skilled at stirring emotion, Warren continued, her tone unwavering. But when you ask them to break things down using logic, they pivot to anecdotes. Ted Cruz tilted his head, his expression unchanged, as if allowing Warren to walk right into her own rhetorical trap. Warren pressed forward. For example, Senator Cruz, could you explain the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning? A soft ooh spread through the room, not because the question was difficult, but because everyone understood. This wasn't an honest inquiry, it was a test. Raiden looked to Cruz. Ted didn't flinch or evade. Deductive reasoning starts with a general principle and leads to a specific conclusion. Inductive reasoning gathers observations and forms a general principle from them, Cruz replied, crisp and clear. He paused, then added, but if you think education ends with knowing the difference between the two, then you've probably never sat in a classroom where a student stays silent because he can't afford the textbook. That line wasn't shouted, but it reverberated through the studio, quietly powerful. In the back row, the young Latina student sat motionless, her hands clenched just slightly, not from tension, but as if Cruz's words touched on something deeply familiar. Warren smirked, lips tight. So, instead of answering, you pivoted to a story. Cruz nodded unfazed. I told a story because, where I come from, stories are the only thing nobody corrects for grammar. A soft laugh slipped out from the third row. Not loud, but enough for Warren to sense the mood was shifting. Raiden shifted the topic, reading from his notes. A recent survey found that 62% of young people say they feel underestimated in political discussions just because their language isn't standard. What did they say? I may not say it right, but that doesn't mean I don't have something to say. He turned to Cruz. Have you ever felt that way, Senator? Cruz met his gaze directly. I once had a teacher who made me read every word out loud. If I messed up, he didn't correct me. He'd just ask if I understood what I'd read. If I said yes, he'd reply, then you don't need to read it again. The room grew quiet, not out of boredom, but the kind of hush when something real is finally being said. Warren stopped looking at Cruz and now glanced at Raiden, then at the camera, shifting in her seat as if realizing she was losing the room, even if no one said it out loud. In the back row, the young woman leaned forward, her letter now half unfolded in her lap. The audience didn't notice, but the camera did. Warren tried one more time. You say you learn from life, but all I hear is someone good at retelling their pain. It stirs up emotion, but does it help people know right from wrong? Cruz didn't answer at first. He let the silence hang. 1, 2, 3 seconds. Then he spoke, slow and deliberate. You want right and wrong defined on a chart. Where I grew up, right and wrong weren't about words. It was about who stayed behind after everyone else walked out. A straight row of seats remained motionless. The girl in the back folded her paper again, resting it in her lap. Her eyes weren't just watching now, they were waiting. Raiden sat quietly for a few seconds, then turned to the main camera. "We'll take a 1-minute break," Raiden announced. The stage lights dimmed. No one got up. No one smiled. By now, no one wondered who was winning because this wasn't a debate anymore. It was the moment before something irreversible happened, and nobody in that room was quite ready for it. A soft silence settled across the studio, stretching just long enough to break the momentum. Not so long as to make it awkward. Raiden said nothing. Warren said nothing. In the back row, the young Latina student still hadn't stood up, but now her hands had fully unfolded the letter in her lap. No one noticed, but somewhere you could feel that someone was waiting for something to break the tension, even if they didn't know what. Ted Cruz was the first to break the silence. He didn't rush. He didn't look at Warren. He simply spoke quietly, saying something no one expected. "I used to not understand what I was saying, and that lasted through my first 2 years of school." The entire room drew a quiet breath. "I read, but I didn't comprehend. I memorized, but I was too afraid to ask questions. I nodded because I was scared someone would call me dumb." He paused, not to catch his breath, but to let the words settle. "I had a teacher, an older man, a former civil rights lawyer, who taught a class called The Constitution for People Who Still Don't Believe They Belong in Law School." A few soft laughs, not mocking, but the kind that says, "I felt that way too." He didn't start with chapter 1. He started by asking, "Has anyone here ever felt they weren't allowed to speak in class?" Cruz glanced out over the room. No hands rose. They didn't need to. Their eyes lingered on him a little longer. "I raised my hand that day. He didn't praise me, didn't call me brave. He just asked why." Cruz let the pause linger. "I said, because I thought smart people didn't need to ask again." A woman in the center row exhaled softly. Her husband gave her a small, knowing nod. The teacher said, "The one who doesn't ask is the one who stops learning." Then he looked at me for a long time and said, "If you pass the test without understanding, you didn't win. You just learned to make other people comfortable with your ignorance." A subtle wave passed through the left side of the room. People who had stayed silent before now nodded, maybe for the first time that evening. Cruz looked up. "From that day on, I started asking. I asked about things I thought I already knew. I asked how to use words I thought I'd mastered. I even asked things that embarrassed me." Raiden clenched his hand, not from emotion, but because he realized this wasn't about television or winning an argument. Cruz had just said what many in the room had never dared to say. "Even after I graduated, I learned slower. I wrote more slowly. I spoke less fluently. But I've never sat beside someone I couldn't understand, and I've never made them feel small for not knowing." Warren stayed silent. No nod, no objection. She looked toward the lights, uncertain now whether anything she'd laughed at earlier was actually funny anymore. Cruz finished in a steady voice. "I learned from the person who asked me, 'Do you understand?' Not from someone who wanted to be impressed. I didn't learn to beat anyone in this room. I learned so I wouldn't get lost in a room where no one stops long enough to explain things again." Camera 2 panned to the student in the back row. She was folding her letter again, not to hide it, but almost as if she was preparing to lift it, not even she knowing why this was the moment. No one could have predicted what happened next. Not the host, not a panelist, not anyone with a microphone. But from the very back row, where no one had paid attention for over 20 minutes, a young woman stood up. No security stopped her. There was no warning sound, no announcement. She stepped out of her seat, walked straight to the center aisle, and stopped 5 steps from the stage, the light just brushing her shoulders. Raiden March didn't get a word out. Warren watched her. Cruz met her eyes and didn't look away. She didn't wait for permission, didn't raise her hand to speak. She simply said, "Excuse me, I'm not on the list of speakers, but if it's all right, I'd like to read a letter. A letter I once sent to Senator Cruz." The entire room went silent. Warren leaned back, arms folded. Raiden didn't interrupt. Cruz neither nodded nor shook his head. He simply met the young woman's gaze and waited. She unfolded the letter. It was worn, creased at the top corner, purple ink, the first line showing the faded trace of a name she'd almost written and then scratched out. She read, not trembling, not cocky, just in the simple voice of someone who's reading what they wrote from the heart and almost forgot they had ever had the courage. "Senator Cruz, I wrote this letter at the end of March while preparing my scholarship application. I didn't know where to start. Nobody in my family had ever written a letter like this." The camera cut to Warren's face. All sarcasm was gone now, her look thoughtful. The student went on, "I'm the daughter of a single mother. My mom only finished the 8th grade. Growing up, I was told not to use words people didn't understand because they'd say I was showing off. But when I heard you speak online, it was the first time I'd ever seen someone who talked like my mom and yet was a senator." Cruz closed his eyes for a moment. not for long, but long enough for those near him to see the quiet inhale. I quoted you in my essay. I wrote, "Education isn't about leaving where you're from. It's about learning how to come back home without shame." A faint sniffle came from the second row, the source unclear. The young woman paused. Her voice remained steady. "You probably don't remember me, but when I got the scholarship, I received a short email. It said, 'I don't need to know your score. I just want you to remember.' No one is wrong for asking questions in the language their mother gave them." A middle-aged man bowed his head. He had asked a question during the Q&A, but now couldn't remember what it had been. The student read her final line. "I just wanted to say, if anyone here believes you don't represent real education, they should know you were the first person who made me believe I deserve to learn without lowering my voice or changing how I speak." Another wave of silence swept the room, but this time it wasn't a silence waiting to be filled. It was the silence of people who understood there was nothing left to say and nothing more that needed to be said. Warren didn't bow her head. Elizabeth Warren didn't respond. Raiden March let go of the table and brought his hands together, not to pray, but in that instinctive gesture people make when they realize they have just witnessed something true. No one had planned for this. Cruz kept looking at the student, not crying, not rushing to embrace her. He simply placed his hand over his chest, that same spot where, by habit, you keep the things worth remembering, even when you don't have to carry them with you. The young woman quietly folded her letter again. She said nothing else, didn't ask for applause, didn't bow. She returned to her seat, eyes down, but everyone in the studio kept watching her. Not because she'd stood up, but because she'd reminded them of the last time they wrote a letter and wondered if the person on the other end would ever read it. There was no viral hashtag after the show, no reaction video breaking down who won or lost, no tweet threads linking Elizabeth Warren's name to the word canceled. What did spread, quietly but powerfully, was a 3-minute, 42-second video, unedited, unscored, captured by Camera 3, showing a student standing at the center of the studio, reading a Warren handwritten letter to the man who once made her believe she was worthy of learning. The clip was posted by a small account called Letters We Never Sent. By morning, it had been reshared over 100,000 times, but not with outrage or fury, just simple captions. "I wish I'd written something like that to Mr. Martinez in the 8th grade. I was once asked, 'Do you understand?' And it turned out to be the most beautiful question in my life. I cried, not because of the letter, but because I once tore up a letter like that, thinking I wasn't good enough to send it." A middle school teacher in Atlanta printed out the letter. She placed a copy on every student's desk. At the top, she added a handwritten line. "If you've never written a letter to someone, today is a good day to start." At a community college in Fresno, the dean changed the entire first-day curriculum for new students to a single assignment. Write to the first person who made you feel like you could learn something. One student wrote, "My grandmother, because every morning she asked, 'Did you learn anything today?' even though she couldn't read." Another wrote, "A bus driver. He let me sit near the front when I forgot my glasses," without saying a word. No one debated Senator Cruz's academic record anymore. No one asked Senator Warren if she had a comeback. People stopped picking sides. Because of that letter, the question changed from who is right to who taught you without even knowing they were teaching. In California, an education podcast launched a special series, My Teacher Didn't Have a Name Tag. Hundreds of listeners wrote in. An elderly woman shared how a retired soldier taught her to count change. A chef remembered the librarian who encouraged him to learn French. A woman from Minnesota recalled her father, who never smiled but always asked, "Did you understand the lesson?" and never once laughed at a wrong answer. A public library in Ohio opened a temporary exhibit called The Letters We Never Sent. On the walls, people posted notes. "To Mrs. Ngach, my kindergarten teacher in 1997, you didn't scold me when I said the wrong number. I've never forgotten that. To the motorbike driver back then, thanks for teaching me how to ask prices without fear. I work in sales now. To the vice principal who taught me the difference between I understand and I got the answer right. I'm now teaching that to my child." After that evening, Ted Cruz didn't appear on any more talk shows. He didn't grant interviews, didn't accept invitations to panels, didn't join any follow-up broadcasts. When a reporter asked his Senate office for comment, they received only a brief, untitled reply. "I don't need to be remembered. I just hope someone remembers the first person who made them feel they were worth being taught." Elizabeth Warren didn't face backlash. There were no boycott campaigns, no angry threads. But at later educational forums where she spoke, people no longer asked about degrees. No one asked, "Where did you study?" They only asked, "You didn't see him? Who did you learn from?" And Warren each time found she didn't have a quick answer, because that isn't something you write on a resume. A week after the broadcast, a college student posted a photo on Reddit, a classroom whiteboard. In bold marker, no new lesson today. Today we learned to write what we never said. Taped in the corner was a printout of the student's letter from the show. At the bottom, handwritten, "I'm still learning, but I no longer believe I'm lacking." No one knew for sure who the student was. The account that posted the original video never used a real name, never answered invitations. But one blurry photo surfaced from backstage, dimly lit. The student stood next to Cruz. No hug, no tears. Just Cruz handing her a folded slip of paper, only 2 lines written on it. "This was the question I was once afraid to ask. You just taught me how to ask it in my own voice." There were no debates afterward, just stories. Stories of people who taught others to write, to find their words, to rise. Not through microphones, not on screens, but through a single gentle question. Do you understand? And that's when people realized Cruz didn't win because he was more educated, not because he argued better, not because he had the sharpest point. He won because someone once learned from him and never forgot. No one stood to applaud when the program ended. No long round of clapping, no colored lights, no music signaling the end. Only a room that had just experienced something real, something no one could quite name. Cruz left the stage as the show wrapped. No lingering, no photos, no autographs. He walked through the hallway, backstage, where a technician handed him something small, a letter folded in thirds in an unmarked envelope. He didn't need to ask who it was from. He didn't reread it. It was the very letter the student had read aloud in front of the room, now returned to him with one handwritten line added at the end. "I'm still learning, but I no longer feel like I'm missing anything. And if anyone asks, 'Who did you learn from?' I won't be afraid to answer." He folded it again, but nothing, and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket, the pocket where you keep things that don't need to be shown, only remembered. A week later, no one talked about the show anymore. There were no new arguments, but people found themselves opening old drawers, searching for forgotten letters, class photos, the first question that ever made them want to understand something, not just memorize it. An 8th grade student wrote a letter to her literature teacher. "You never gave high grades, but you always asked, 'How did that make you feel?' I didn't understand it then, but now I do. I know now. That was a kind of learning without a lecture." A father told his son how he'd learned his ABCs in a village school from a teacher who didn't speak English, but knew how to rest a hand on a child's shoulder when they mispronounced a word, then nod without shame. No one created a support Ted Cruz group. No one organized a march. No one built an argument to defend him because no one needed to. He had already been defended by those he'd once given a reason to believe. They were worth continuing to learn. On his podcast, Right in March, the host was once asked, "Why didn't you step in when Senator Warren began testing Senator Cruz on critical thinking?" He answered, "Because I did that once on another show. And back then, I stole someone's chance to prove they didn't need to speak loudly to be heard. This time I stayed quiet and I learned the right thing." A retired teacher in Florida wrote, "I used to think I taught the wrong way. I didn't use fancy words, had no PowerPoint. I just asked my students, 'Do you understand?' But when I saw that student reading her letter, I realized that might have been the only thing I taught right." One photo spread quietly at the end, not from the talk show, not a quote graphic or a slogan, just a piece of old paper, handwritten, folded in thirds, resting beside a stack of worn textbooks in a drawer, snapped with a regular phone camera. Caption, "The letter I once thought of tearing up. Now I keep it, not for praise, but to remember that someone once believed I was worth teaching." Where are you watching this video? In a classroom, on your way home, or into a place where you once thought you weren't good enough to understand what was being said? If someone ever asked you, "Do you understand?" and didn't mind pausing to wait for your answer, please leave their name or just a single initial as a way of saying you haven't forgotten. And if you believe that true education isn't about how long your explanation is, but about who dares to stop and ask the quietest person if they understand, then subscribe. Because here we keep telling stories where no one wins except for the one who stays behind to explain what's right, even when no one else is waiting.